Let me try. All right, so recording has started. You should have got a little pop-up button that it just tells you that it's being recorded, and you can say got it, and then you click on the got it button, and then you're able to stay with us in the webinar. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Great, you are in the right place if you are here for the Environmental and Sustainability Education Grant Writing webinar. We're going to share a bunch of different tips and maybe some tricks and recommendations for successfully writing grants in these areas. And we've got a good team available to do this, experienced grant writers that have had some success. And we also have a couple program officers who manage the grants. So we're really pleased to be able to do this webinar and to record it for other colleagues and friends to access in the future. And hopefully you'll, everybody, even if you're an experienced grant writer, hopefully you learn at least one more or one new tip along the way. And next slide, please. Here we go. So meet the presenters. So my name is Dr. Steve Curlin. I am the Director of Education at Stroud Water Research Center. We're based in Dale, Pennsylvania, but we actually do work all over the world and all 7 continents. And we do education projects in all kinds of geographies and are able to do things here at our sites. We travel, we do a lot of teacher professional development. So we're really pleased. I was a former professor of science education and environmental education, and also a former classroom teacher at a public school in Pennsylvania right out of undergrad. So next, Tammy, go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, back there, yep. All right, Tammy, unmute and go ahead and introduce yourself and then pass it out to the next person.
Sorry, when I share screen, it sometimes blocks things out. So, hi all, I'm Tammy Peffer. I'm the Environment and Ecology Content Advisor with Pennsylvania Department of Ed. And this is an amazing team that you're going to be hearing from today, and look into the opportunities they are presenting because it'll take you beyond your classroom.
And next, Kathleen, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kathleen Bansky. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm glad to be with you today. I am the Environmental Education Coordinator for the Department of Environmental Protection, and looking forward to working with you on this, as well as any follow-up that comes out of this session.
And hi, everyone. My name is Elise Trelligan. I coordinate the BWET program, the Bay Watershed Education and Training Program for the NOAA Chesapeake Bay office, which is essentially a grant program to support environmental literacy. I'm excited to be here with you all to share some of the behind the scenes in terms of what I see. And I'll also say that I've been on the other side of things too. I used to work for a nonprofit and spent a lot of time in development and writing grants. So I can bring some of that perspective to this conversation as well. Happy to be here.
And our 5th presenter there is going to imitate between 2 important things, this webinar and also a different meeting. Nanette Markham-Dietrich, a professor of science and STEM education at Millersville University. She helped us do this webinar the first time and has updated it for the second time. She's going to try to pop in if possible. If not, we'll take care of her contributions. Also, we thank Nanette for helping us construct this presentation. Next. All right, an introduction to the world of funding. Wow, where can you and have you found funding for environmental education and related things, sustainability? This is your first prompt. Please share your answer if you have found funding for these topics in the past. Please share that answer in the chat. and we'll have a running a list here of our whole webinar community of different places where you have found or been able to raise money or get donations or even for environmental education and sustainability projects. Great, already starting to see a bunch in the chat. Go ahead and keep adding those to the chat as you think of them anytime throughout the webinar. So first order of business. Before you even start writing a grant, you should really think about what your needs are and wishes are. So you should create, and do this with your staff, this is our first recommendation, create a wish list, a new projects list, a pitch sheet, 1-page or 2-page pitch sheet, or an initiatives list for potential funders. Keep it related to your mission. Avoid mission creep as much as possible. This process will really force you to think through what you need funding for, or materials in place of funding, and it helps it make sure that your efforts and your time, will be aligned to your mission. We suggest, and a bunch of other authors would suggest, that you keep this to 2 pages max, front and back of a single piece of paper, and you should have one paragraph or so for each of the different initiatives or things on your wish list that you want to pitch, either in a formal grant proposal or in a meeting with potential funders that you can hand this to them. And you should have estimates in there, budget estimates about what it will take to get a new initiative or project up and running, and then what it will take on a yearly basis to keep it going. A lot of times we forget about that for maintaining or sustaining projects. So make sure you include that too. And now competitive grants, you'll find competitive grants from federal government agencies, some that are available just for certain regions. You'll find them for state agencies, and you'll find them from local governments. You'll also find competitive grants from foundations. You at least have to submit something to them, sometimes the pitch sheet or proposal. And similarly, but maybe a little less writing, on the foundation and the businesses side, you're going to have to submit something. Probably not as much writing as the federal and state agencies, but you're still going to have your thoughts in order. Next slide. Getting started again. All right. I recommend you do some research first before you start. I had the pleasure to be able to teach a graduate level course when I was at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and it was in grant writing and environmental education and sustainability, basically. So the first book listed there was the text that I used for that graduate course. It's a really good text. It's a great one, came recommended from others that have done similar types of courses in the past. It has a lot similar to the B and C, the winning grants, step-by-step, and the complete book of grant writing. All 3 of these have good information to read, but they also have activities for you to do. They have templates, they have activities for you to walk through, thought processes, but also for you to write things down and really, formulate your ideas before you start writing that proposal for a very specific grant. The next thing that our team recommends is serve on a grant review team. Volunteer to be a reviewer of grants. That is one of the best ways to really gauge what really needs to be in a proposal. How much detail do you need to include, throughout the proposal, and what things, should you focus on? And a number of us on this panel have done that. Serve on a grant review team, be a reviewer. Number 3, read past awardee project descriptions. They're almost always available on the same website from whatever organization is funding and making the grant available. They like to list and celebrate the past awardees, and there's always at least a paragraph or so. So find out what was funded in the past, and you'll find out if your project, your idea, aligns with those ideas and has a good chance of funding if you're in the right ballpark at least, or if you need to look to a different funder. You can also reach out to other past awardees, see some past proposals, get some ideas from them. Talk to the program officer, number 4. Highly recommend this, especially with federal and state grants that are very competitive types of grants. Talk to the program officer. Their contact information is listed. Send them a small pitch, a 1 to 2 page written description, something we talked about on the page before, right? The previous slide. Have an idea already in place, an outline or a description, and send it to them by email and ask if you can schedule a time to Zoom with them or talk with them on the phone and talk through their ideas. They can't tell you if your project is going to get funded or not, because the review team does that, but they can give you, some feedback to help you if you're in the right ballpark. That is an eligible project for this type of grant. They can answer those eligibility questions. They can point you to other resources. So it is really helpful. And it's also just good to start building that relationship. And number 5, pay attention to the cycle and application process of the grant. Some grants only have one part of the process, and it gets after it's announced, and you just write it up and you submit it, whether it's something you submit it through an online system, or you're filling things in, or you're emailing somebody something. But others have other steps where sometimes you submit an abstract or an idea outline. Sometimes they call that an intent to apply letter. And sometimes they call that a pre-application. And then sometimes different funding agencies will allow everyone to then follow up and submit a full proposal. And other agencies and organizations will then invite submitters based on your pre-application or your intent to apply. And plan ahead. Grant writing is not something you can typically do last minute. There's always deadlines and everybody's very busy, but try to plan ahead. And our team recommends at least 6 weeks ahead of time. Keep the grants in your calendar so you know pretty much when they become open each year, and be looking for them for as soon as they open, see what the new guidelines are, the new focus areas are, and then you can start your process. All right, I think we're switching to Tammy for this slide.
Hi, all. Yes, so a couple things that you need to think about when you're reading the request for proposal is my project even fundable? Does it meet the requirements of the grant that I'm looking at? And there are usually some question and answers or Q&As. Just go through that quickly before you start digging in too deep. Understand how your objectives need to fit into their program, and look at your eligibility. Sometimes your entity might not be eligible, but someone that you work closely with would be. Or sometimes the funder might have specific individual organizations that they want to bring into it, so types of organizations. And we all know that in environmental education and environmental literacy work, no entity is an island. So if you're looking at something, it speaks to you, look for a partner that can fit the funder's priorities as well. And then you need to think about, what are we going to do when this money is gone? How are we going to sustain it? If it involves a project, how are we going to maintain it? If it requires actual physical materials, how are we going to get the new materials? And look at, again, finding partnerships, because the grant funders want to know that your grant is not going to be a one-hit wonder. They want to make sure that it's going to have lasting impact. Another important piece is understand who your audiences are. Understand if you are working or proposing work with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or with environmental justice populations. And in Pennsylvania, environmental justice we have environmental justice areas in 66 of 67 of our counties. So that's not a hard reach, but it's good to understand who you are working with, who your intent is, and make sure that you have community members from those communities that you're proposing work with in on your grant team. Because you can't say you're going to work with them and they have no idea. Okay, so you need to do that. The other piece that you're going to need to look at with these RFPs is, are there specific topics or specific structures that they're asking for you to develop? Is it program development? Is it curriculum development? Are they looking for you to develop an infrastructure, a support system and network that is going to support the work? So each of the grants will have a different focus. Make sure you read it. And again, if you have any questions, call that program officer. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. Now, one of the things that we mentioned so far is the environmental justice. Environmental justice is very, very closely linked to environmental issues and impacts, including climate change and resilience issues. In Pennsylvania, we look at environmental justice, not just from the demographics of it, which is at least 30% minority and or 20% low income, but there's an overlay that connects it where they look at existing environmental issues and parameters that are being measured. And if you have a question as to whether or not you are in an environmental justice area or near an environmental justice area, we have two very good tools. And if someone could copy and lift them into the chat, we have the EJ viewer. And then we also have a cooperative project that Stroud and Chesapeake Bay Watershed pulled together that has school stream, best management practices, and equity evaluation. So you can clear and see if some of your ideas fit into those pieces. Now, in other states, this Chesapeake Bay Watershed piece is there, but you can also go to an organization called EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has a function called EJ Screen. And you can look into that too. The EJ viewer and the Chesapeake Bay watershed pieces are very user-friendly. And EJ Screen has a lot of parameters that you would need to understand, but they do have some good tools to help you explore it. Okay, now on to Elise.
Thanks, Tammy. And I just dropped some of those links into the chat, so feel free to check them out. So I'm going to get a little bit into actually like the design and like starting your proposal. And Tammy and Steve really like paved the way of some things that you want to be thinking about beforehand. I have just a couple things to add. The first one is like the first question that you should be asking yourself is why? Why do you want to apply for this particular grant or this particular opportunity through a foundation or corporate sponsorship? Maybe you're referencing one of those wish list items that you have already written up, but you should have a really clear vision for what that is. And specifically, you want to think about how the project that you're proposing ties to your organizational goals and your organizational mission. And that will help with the sustainability piece because, like Tammy mentioned, grant funders, we don't really want to fund work that happens like a one-hit wonder, right? That just happens over the course of 1 year or 3 years. We want to invest in something that's going to be sustainable longer term. And if it aligns with your mission, that tends to, be more likely to stick around. Additionally, the project should meet the needs of your program, your partners that you're also involving in this. And it might not, you might be ticking a couple of different boxes here. So it might not be the exact same need or goal that you have, but it also fits their interests. And then lastly, and most importantly, probably I'd say is that it's meeting the needs of your community. And in your grant proposal, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate what those needs are and how you came to identify those needs. And again, authenticity here is really important. So being able to show that you did a needs assessment or that you communicated with a core group of partners that were able to validate this sort of approach is really helpful. And again, just like back to the mission creep thing, like, grants pop up and they come in our inbox all the time. And it's helpful to just think about, like, is this going to help me to meet my organizational goals? Or am I kind of just chasing the funding? And it's really tempting, right? Especially when there are cool things that you're seeing in NOFOs and RFPs. But just try to bring it back to like what it is, how is this going to serve you long term? And how are you going to serve your community long term? Because you also don't want to be implementing programming and then leave. That doesn't usually leave a good taste in anyone's mouth. So after you kind of figure out if there's alignment between your organization, the needs of the community, and then the actual like funders organization, making sure that you're going to be meeting some of their needs too, you're going to want to check in on permissions. So depending on where you sit, if you are in the school system, you might be checking in with your principal or your superintendent. If you're working at a nonprofit, you might be checking in with your executive director or your board of directors. And really, there's a couple things that you want to think about. Do you have the capacity to carry out this work? So the people power to be able to do it, or do you need to bring some partners in maybe to help you do that, like Tammy was describing? Do you have the accounting capacity and the capacity to report? We know that some types of funding require more or less of this. So corporate sponsorships, I would say on the whole, generally, are typically a lot less intensive in actually the reporting process. Whereas a federal grant like NOAA BWET, I know that it's difficult sometimes, right? You have to be able to put in your financial reports every 6 months and do your progress reports and, stay on top of other kind of federal requirements. So you just want to think about those two things. And then the last one is, look at whether it's a reimbursement grant or if you're going to get those funds up front, because you want to also make sure that you have the liquid assets to be able to run the program too. And what I mean by that is if it's reimbursement and you're having to shell out a whole bunch of cash to do, teacher stipends or rent transportation or whatever that looks like, are you going to be able to front those costs and then be able to get reimbursed afterwards? Yeah, thanks, Julie. And then lastly, are you doing research with human subjects? And Annette is really the expert on this, but I would say that, if you're going to be collecting data that you eventually are going to be using to publish or contribute to scholarship that include human subjects, you might need to go through the IRB process. And there's a really nice like dichotomous key to help you decide whether or not you need IRB or not. Usually, if you're in the academic space, you do, but it's always helpful to just kind of check on that and make sure. We can go to the next slide, Steve or Tammy, whoever's flipping. All right, so tips for success when you're actually writing the proposal. You want to have a clear and concise 1 to 2 sentence goal, or call it your elevator statement, right? Like, what is it that you want to do? You want to be able to then from there, after saying like what that big picture is, what are the objectives that are going to describe how you're going to meet that goal? So you could say like the goal of this project is to do X, Y, and Z, and here are the strategies that I'm going to employ to get ourselves there. And I'm going to show you a neat tool that I think is helpful for thinking through that in just a minute. Read through that whole NOFO or that whole RFP, make sure you really digest and understand the language that the funder is using. And then they usually will lay out exactly how they want to see your proposal crafted. So they have section headers like who, what, how, why, budget. Try to follow those because oftentimes the reviewers are being asked to look directly at those sections to be able to then say whether or not your proposal meets the certain criteria. And actually, before I go any further, if personally, when I go and look at an RFP or a NOFO, the first thing I do is I go to the evaluation criteria. And that's how I kind of build my proposal backwards because that's really like how you're going to be scored in the end. So that could be a helpful way to look at things too. Again, using their language throughout the text. My example here for this is, BWET, we focus a lot on MIWEs, the Meaningful Watershed Educational Experience. You may as well call it MIWE in your proposal instead of calling it project-based learning. Even those are the same things, a reviewer might not know that and they want to see that exact language showing up. Emphasize your past success and build on the experiences that you already have. Oftentimes funders want to know that you have the capacity to do this, so you can draw on your experience. And experience is not just like the scientific, qualifications that you have or the educational, but also the cultural experience that you and your staff bring to that project as well. You, like I described earlier, describe how you came to the need to do this in the first place. And then when you line everything up, all of your goals, objectives, activities, and deliverables and evaluation, they should all kind of line up at the end. And you can go on to the next slide for me, Tammy. And so this is our handy dandy logic model that I think is really helpful for people for kind of like laying out what their proposal and what all the different objectives kind of line up to be. So this is just a way of kind of like framing things. And some funders will actually ask you to complete a logic model or a similar table. So just like to go over a couple terms quickly, the goal, this is the big picture thing that you're trying to achieve. You might not actually get to it by the end of your project because it's so large. So a goal might be for every single student in Pennsylvania to be environmentally literate. And you may be working in a subsection of that, or every single student in your school district. Probably not going to accomplish that over the course of 1, 3, maybe even 5 years, right? The objectives are then what your audience is going to be able to do or say or feel after the project. So there's a couple of different ways of writing objectives, but the SMART approach is a good one: specific, measurable, time-bound. There are 2 other words that are in there. Maybe somebody can throw them into the chat for me. But SMART goals and SMART objectives are a good way of kind of framing things. Realistic, thank you. And then your outputs, those are the things that you're going to deliver as a part of the project. So let's say you're going to develop curriculum in order to get people towards becoming environmentally literate. That would be an output. And then lastly, your outcomes, these are the audience changes. So this is what's going to be as a result of your project. And you might have short-term outcomes and you might have longer-term outcomes. And they, again, hopefully your short-term ones are happening at the end of your project or by the end of your project, whereas some of your long-term ones may be a little bit after that, but not as big as a goal. I'll say one other thing in terms of like the writing process, and just something that's personally been that I like to read. And this is not necessarily what every reviewer or program coordinator would say, but I think it's helpful when people put a combination of like these very specific logistical pieces that it's really clear to be able to understand what they're doing, but then also incorporate storytelling with that and to help people to really give a feel for like, what is this going to look like and what is the result going to be? You really want to sell it to your funder or your potential funder. All right. I think that's all for me.
Elise, there were some questions about sharing the logic model in the chat. I think that would be good, but keep in mind that each funder may have their own version of a logic model. So learn from this one and then see how you can apply it to the next one.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Tammy. And I'm going to see if I can find it. This used to be on our website, so I can probably pull it up for us.
Okay, we have Kathleen next.
Okay, partnerships. Project partners draw from the pulling together with partners. Your project will have a greater impact because you're combining your experiences and your expertise to deliver the best program possible. In some grant programs, I think it was mentioned earlier, you may have an entity that's not eligible for the actual grant itself. And those folks could actually be partners with eligible entities in order to deliver the project. When we're looking at partners, some of the things you want to look at is what is the partner's, what kind of a contribution can that partner make? What are their qualifications? Specific to the kind of project that you're doing. You really want to look at partners that a funder will see the link between the partner's contribution and the project that you're proposing to do. Partners can come from all kinds of different places. You can have community-based partners which will involve local organizations. There may be resource networks. You might want to be a partner with other schools or organizations. And a great place, a tool, is the PAE, Pennsylvania Association of Environmental Educators website. That's www.paee.net. And they actually have a drop down there where it says find EE near me. And so if you're looking to put together a project proposal, and because we were talking about that earlier, it's going to take at least 6 weeks before you submit your application, it's a good place to look for, are there other providers of EE that you can maybe reach out to and use your partner to help actually develop your proposal. One of the things that we want to look for when we identify partners is getting a letter of commitment from them. And when we're talking about a letter of commitment, we're not talking about a letter of support. A letter of support might come from an entity that's not going to directly be involved with your project, but they know you, they've worked with you in other things, and they support your work in general. A letter of commitment is really going to talk about what the partner is committing to bring to the project. In those letters of commitment, you want to be very, very specific. You want to identify who is the partner, what's their relationship, and the reason that they're partnering on your project. You want to identify the type of commitment that the partner is making, whether that's cash or in-kind programming assistance. Cash being money. We are going to donate $500 to purchase resources versus in-kind. You may have volunteers that are committing their time. And then importantly, you want to identify how that partner's commitment is going to contribute to the project. Are they committing to people, travel, resources, or maybe some other type of cost associated with the project? And I would go a step further. And while this slide talks about partner letters of commitment, you as an applying organization, if you're a teacher, I might consider going to my principal or someone in the school and getting a letter of commitment from within your organization, from the folks that are higher up that are going to, if you're going to be applying for a project that involves reimbursement, having a letter of commitment from the applying organization will certainly strengthen your proposal. I think it's the next slide. 1, 2.
All right, yeah, I think I've got the next few slides as we transition to the sort of the meat of the proposal here in these next 2 slides. I just want to add that, yeah, I completely agree, and I want to emphasize the point about partners' letters of commitment. Get a signature from an administrator or whoever's leading your organization, and make sure they know what's going on. And some funders, for instance, like NSF, National Science Foundation, they have to be letters of commitment, saying what the different partners are going to do. You are not allowed to submit letters of support to National Science Foundation, for example. You will be immediately disqualified if you do. They won't even review your proposal. So just having somebody say, this sounds like a great project, we support it, that's not enough. It has to be a letter of commitment that they're involved and what they're going to do. So now transitioning here to the meat or the guts of the proposal. Read the solicitation very carefully. The RFP or the NOFO, the request for proposals. Create a list of required elements. What do you need to include? What do you need to upload? Who do you need to get information from? And they're all going to be a little bit different. So make sure you read each document asking for proposals very carefully. Assemble the necessary partners. I would say that's one of the first things you do, along with your logic model that Elise talked about. So you can really outline your project through that logic model. Get your core team, get your partners together, get them on board. Have them help write, the proposal. That really it really helps to have lots of partners involved, and involved not just in the implementation, but also to help in the writing, at least the core partners or the leadership team. Create a writing plan and timeline, I would say, starting 6 weeks ahead of time. Which pieces do you need to tackle first? Which other partners do you need to pull in? How do you refine your goals, your objectives? And then what are you going to do to implement the project, and how are you going to evaluate it? So the proposal narrative is always one of the larger pieces. That's the main body of your text that you're writing in the grant proposal. It usually has a scoring criteria that is outlined in the request for proposal. So definitely take a look at that. Sometimes that's an appendix of the request for proposals. Don't ignore it. That's how they're going to score your proposal. So make sure you go down and look at the scoring rubric or criteria at the end. Create your project timeline, matching the availability of the time that you're allowed to spend the funds. Sometimes your project may continue afterwards, and you may have to be looking for additional funding. And you can talk about that and write about that and how you're going to sustain your project after any particular grant funding ends. And importantly, sounds very simple, this next one, format your proposal narrative to match the requirements, the sections that are in the request for proposals. Don't make the reviewers search for different things that they have to check off and review. Use headers, use subheaders, use the same headers and subheaders that the funder uses. All right, so there's no need to get fancy in this type of writing. No need to be creative in that sense of how you organize your proposal narrative. And then, of course, begin writing. Now, the budget. I want to get a little bit into budget. All kinds of neat things. Some people really like doing budgets, some people don't. But you really need to think through your budget. Your budget should reflect what you're trying to do. And you should have the largest percentage of the budget to the biggest pieces, or what would require the biggest or largest amounts of money. So review the solicitation very carefully first to see what is allowed and what is not allowed. For instance, a lot of funders will not allow you to buy T-shirts for the kids that participate in your summer camp, right? But some will. You can buy things that are labeled under participant support that you're going to give away to them, but they can't. A lot of funders don't like you to just have giveaways for the sake of being giveaways. However, if your giveaways to the participants are instructional in nature and learning and focused, then those are typically allowed. So make sure you really look and see what's allowed and what's not allowed, and that will always be listed. Think carefully about what is really needed for the to complete the project. Right? Craft the budget using the templates that are provided by the organization that's giving the money out. You may have your own budget template or your own planning budget planning template, just like we do, and that's your internal planning. But each agency or organization will require a different amount of detail and may even have different major section headers within your budget. So you've got to follow their budget, not how your internal budget process or internal budget section headers, as we could think of them as. And importantly, don't just include the numbers, but also include what's called a budget justification, or sometimes called a budget narrative. If you have the opportunity to do that, do it. That's your chance to elaborate on the numbers, and another space for you that's usually in the appendix that doesn't count towards your page limit, where you can say a little more about how you're going to use that money and exactly what it's going to be used for over the life of the grant. So that gives you a little more space, but when I review and act and serve as a reviewer, I take a very close look at the budget to make sure the budget matches what the proposed project is. Other requirements. Are there any other specific requirements by the particular funder? Something like, do you have to complete some training? Like a MeWe 101 online training, for instance, from Elise's organization, from NOAA. Or are there travel requirements associated with the grant? Do you have to attend some regional meetings, with the funder and the other grantees in that cycle? And then make sure you include that travel in your budget. All right, next slide, some more budget things. All right, we're about halfway through the budget stuff. Go ahead and use the chat again, put some more questions you might have about budgets. If I don't answer them from the last slide or this slide, we'll try to get to those either both in the chat with responses or at the end. So what do some of these budget things mean? All right, fringe benefits. Those are the costs associated with your personnel for all of the extra benefits that they may get from your organization, school, or wherever that personnel is working. So you have your salary cost, which is your basic personnel cost. That could either be your yearly salary divided into the number of months or weeks or even days or sometimes even hours that each person will contribute to the project. Or it may be maybe an hourly wage person, and then that's their hourly wage. But fringes are all the other things that are associated with it. So it's their health care benefits. It's their retirement benefits that are contributed by the organization. It's all the Social Security, the FICA benefits, even for part-time workers. It's all of those extra kind of perks, hopefully, that people have that are taken out of their paychecks. So those have got to be included too. Those are part of personnel costs, but sometimes you need to list them as a separate category. What is an indirect cost or an F&A cost, administrative and facility cost? All right, these are the costs that your school or organization has to stay in operation, to support the work that the staff does. So this can be all kinds of things. This could be your building. This could be the electricity. That's our first example we always think about is, part of this is the cost of keeping the electricity on in your building. And because if you don't have that space, then you're not able to get the work done. So it's the heating, the cooling, the electricity of your building. It's all of the other support staff. It's your accounting staff, your building maintenance staff, your IT staff. It's all those other staff that contribute. And there's a number of other things too that are in those indirect costs. The indirect cost is sometimes specified or limited by the funder. And they will give you typically a percent. Sometimes an amount, but typically a percent, and it may be 10% of your total budget is the max allowed for indirect costs. A lot of private and smaller private foundations, that's their limit. Some will have 20%. There's a number of funding sources in Pennsylvania that have a 20% limit on indirect costs. And then some will not have a limit on indirect costs. But if they don't have a limit and you put indirect costs in there, you have to justify where that number or percent came from. And the best way to do that is to have a NICRA, which is a federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. You can get one of those, any organization can get one, especially nonprofits. You can get one of those by figuring out what all those costs are. And then working with a federal agency. We work with National Science Foundation, and our federally negotiated indirect cost agreement is an agreement with them that gets renewed every 5 years, I believe. So they have certified and agreed that it takes a certain percentage for our organization to function and support the actual projects that are going on. And then you include that document as an appendix with your proposal. And then you can include that money in your as a budget line in your budget. If you don't have a calculation for that, then that's going to look a little skeptical to the reviewers. Where did this come from? Where did all these numbers of your operations come from? You need to justify that and have an approved number. Next one, matching funds. There's different categories of these. They can be in kind or actual money. Kathleen alluded to this a little bit ago. In kind is something where somebody is contributing, but it's not actual money. It may be people time, or it may be materials. It could be all kinds of different things, but you can assign a value to that. Actual matching funds, we think of as money. What money are you putting in? Are they putting in? Maybe you got it from another grant, or you got a donation, or the PTA is going to contribute so much from the school. You can list that as that's actual money. For volunteers, there is an actual volunteer rate that you should include. You shouldn't make up an hourly rate for volunteers or a flat rate. You should include the actual rate that is calculated. And you can look on this website. It's a federal website where they calculate every year the different hourly rate for volunteers. You can use a federal rate, or if you're in a specific area, you can actually kind of zoom into your local area, your state, and even your town, your city or town, and know what the volunteer rate is for your local area. And that's what you should include. How much per hour would your volunteers be contributing as in-kind volunteer matching funds? Next one, supplies and materials versus equipment. Sometimes we also call these resources. I know DEP does. So supplies and materials or resources, those are things that you need to do the project. We typically in environmental education and sustainability, we think of those as instructional resources, right? If you're doing a stream study, what do you need, to collect macroinvertebrates? What material, supplies do you need? Or if you're do you need some water chemistry test kits? Those are instructional supplies. If you're running workshops, what supplies do you need to run the workshops? Equipment is usually something much bigger. National Science Foundation says equipment is something that's over $5,000 for a single item. So that would be something that goes in a high-tech lab or something that's much bigger. Some grants don't even allow equipment purchasing. So you're focusing on instructional supplies in most cases. Okay. Travel costs and per diem. You could estimate those, and you could look up all kinds of local hotels and things like that and get actual rates. But the simplest way to do it and the best way to do it is to look on this website, the gsa.gov website, and they will also tell you what the current rate is by, updated every year and by city. And you can figure out what the travel costs are, what the mileage rate is, what the going hotel rate is, what the maximum reimbursement for meals is while you're traveling. All of those things are there on that website, and you can drill down to state or even local city level for those. Tammy mentioned in the chat, be careful about infrastructure and capital projects. Yeah, those are even something different. Those aren't supplies or materials or resources. They're not even equipment. They are completely different. And usually there's very specific grants that are for what we think of as capital projects, infrastructure, buildings. Those are usually more specific grants that are just for contributing to those types of projects. Next slide. I think it might be someone else.
It's me. Okay, so we talked about making sure that we had a timeline for creating the grant. We also need a timeline for the implementation of the grant. And as you're beginning to plan, you need to think, is my timeline realistic? Am I going to be able to get where I want to be by the end of the term of this grant? And you have to work backwards. It's like any kind of project. If you have a goal date, you have to work backwards, look at the pieces that need to make it up, and figure out how much time realistically, and then add extra time on top of that to make sure that you have accounted for enough time. So it's kind of like a backwards design. Think of your goal, think of when you want it accomplished, and then you have to figure out what pieces will fit into that time frame. Will you be able to put out those deliverables? And is this going to be so overwhelming? Are you going to be setting such a pace that you can't address anything else? Then maybe you have it too packed and you need to take a smaller bite this time. Okay. The other thing that you have to be careful with is if you have funding from multiple sources, you have to make sure that you are not overlapping funding projects, making sure that the accounting is very clean. And if you have funding for a similar project, make sure that it's supplementing that project and not replicating that project. That's a very important thing. What's interesting is a lot of reviewers for the big projects may be familiar with other work. And you need to make sure that you are not, it would be called double dipping, basically, or braiding. So you have to make sure that that's not being done, especially when you have federal funds. There's very specific accounting as to what can go where and how it is accounted for. So what other things you need to do is make sure that the timeline is very clear to your team and to your program officer. It helps keep you on track. It helps you know where everyone is. It helps with communications. And ultimately, the level of detail in that timeline makes sure that everyone knows the steps of what they need to do to get to that end product for the timeline as well. So you have it broken down into the big pieces, and then each piece is smaller pieces of project. And the clearer you are about that, the clearer the reviewers will be about it, and the happier they will be about it as well. Make sure that your timeline matches both your narrative and your logic model. Because if things don't jive, then they're going to say, what are they really talking about? And then last but not least, when you have all those pieces, if you need assistance, if you receive the grant, your project officer or your team members can help you break things down further if you find out that those individual pieces are a little too big. And one of the other really neat things is, depending on the funding source, they might ask you those questions before they allot the funds to make sure that you can really do what you're saying. Don't be offended by that. That is them making sure you're going to be successful. And Elise.
All right. Yeah. So this is kind of the end of the proposal process. And then we're going to move into a couple of quick examples, but these are my 4 tips that I have before you actually click the submit button. Oh, sorry, Tammy, we just went to the next slide accidentally, but so hopefully you've left yourself enough time to do this. And I'll just say that, like, pressing the submit button is sometimes a little bit scary. Just don't wait to the last minute, right? Try to submit it like 24 hours in advance. That's before my 4 tips. But in that period, make sure that you go through, crosswalk all of your objectives, your activities, check out that timeline, your budget, make sure that everything is lining up. And then again, check against the review criteria, make sure that you're using the same language, that you've answered all the questions that need to be answered, so that your proposal can score highly. My second tip is make sure that all of your budgets add up. Steve gave the example of sometimes you can submit a budget spreadsheet and a budget narrative, and then your cover page usually has what your total ask is, and then you might have to complete like an SF 424 or another like federal form. You want to make sure that all your numbers are consistent. If they're not, there's a chance that they might take that low number and you might have actually wanted to have like $5,000 extra, but it wasn't consistent across all your pieces. So just make sure that all those are adding up correctly, that your formulas are adding up correctly, that you're using the same numbers in all the same places. Third, make sure that your narrative, your timeline, and cover sheets are all saying the same thing. I can't tell you how many proposals that I've read that like are copy paste jobs from other proposals. And like, it's okay to recycle language, right? Like sometimes you just give a really great description of what it is that your organization does, but make sure that it's consistent across the board. And you're going to want to share like those high level things right up at the front, the number of teachers that you're working with, the number of students, the partners that you're working with, what your deliverables are. And then the most important thing that I've ever done personally in writing a grant is having somebody who knows absolutely nothing about my organization read it. Because they're going to have the same blind spots they're going to have like the same like lack of knowledge that a reviewer might have. And you're going to have some blind spots while you're writing your proposal. You might make an assumption and write an entire proposal about how you are going to provide these environmental education experiences, but never actually describe that you have a full residential center with all these amenities. So the people who don't really have a sense, maybe it's your sister, maybe it's your best friend, they can take a look at it and be like, how's that going to happen? Realize I didn't describe it very well there. So those are my 4 hot tips before you click submit. And again, give yourself just a little bit of time because sometimes things get funny in the process and the internet's weird and people's connections, this and that. Just give yourself time. All right, Tammy, we can go to the next slide. So now we're going to introduce 2 opportunities that are available to applicants in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to kick it off with BWET, I believe. So NOAA BWET, this is the Bay Watershed Education and Training Program. It's run out of seven different regions across the country. I'll say that there's one in the Chesapeake region right now, and then there's also one that serves the Great Lakes region. So there is a little sliver of Pennsylvania that is technically not served at the moment, but we do have state capacity building grants as well. So there is like work that we fund statewide. But ultimately, our goal is to support systemic, meaningful watershed educational experiences. And I'm just going to like super quick, MIWIs are project-based learning. They have an outdoor field experience component. They have students investigating issues, synthesis and conclusions, and ultimately students engage in some sort of action related to that issue. And we really want to focus on, like our focus is on projects that reach an entire grade level of students in 1 or more school districts. So that's just a little bit of perspective there. These are big grants typically, up to $100,000 per year for up to 3 years. We have a commitment to long-term funding because we know that it takes time to get towards systemic. And this is usually enough time for school divisions and or IUs and partners to really be able to build something that's comprehensive, sustainable, and hopefully you can identify some funding to be able to support that longer term within school district budgets or in other spaces. And then again, that's the systemic definitions on there for you. And we also ask that teachers receive 30 hours of professional development, and that's to build up their capacity in delivering outdoor field experiences, supporting the action project component, learning about the environmental issues that they're going to be teaching about. So it's really this kind of comprehensive package that we're looking to support. This is in our systemic MIWI implementation priority, which we typically host. Eligible applications, K-12 school systems, higher ed, community-based organizations, nonprofits, state and local agencies, tribal governments. So we really span the gamut there. And we do ask that right now we have, 25% or more of your land should be in the Chesapeake Bay watershed in order to receive our award. This is for the Chesapeake BWET. There's also the Great Lakes that's available right now too. And then on the next page, I'm going to show you what our priorities were last year. And I can't tell you what they're going to be this year, but they're coming very soon. And it's helpful to see these ones. So Tammy, we can go to the next slide here. So we typically open in late November. I'm hoping for an earlier November this year, but we'll see. You can get the full NOFO on grants.gov. Like everybody's mentioned today, I love to talk to people before they submit an application. I can't tell you whether or not it's going to be funded, but I can definitely point you to other projects that may be thinking in similar ways to you so that you can learn or talk with them and get some of their lessons learned. So systemic MUE implementation, this is for school divisions, this is for IUs, this is for nonprofits that are working systemically in one school or more schools. Last year, we also ran a school district capacity building, which is a little bit more expansive. It provides funds for some of those bigger picture environmental literacy efforts. It could be designing an environmental literacy plan. It could be supporting somebody to coordinate environmental literacy efforts. There's a lot of options in this one. So, you know, the sky's the limit. And lastly, this year we are going to be offering, I can say this, our state capacity building, which essentially we're offering on an every 2-year basis at this point. And this is for state level work. So partnerships and networking and trying to like bring this whole thing forward at that kind of state level. And we're always interested in, you know, the same things that a lot of other grant programs are interested in: community partnerships, climate change, all those hot topics of the day. They're all things that NOAA is thinking about. So that's a little bit of background. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'm really excited. You know, we have funded the Pennsylvania Task Force for the past couple of years, and they've done such a wonderful job at like hosting these webinars and doing a ton of great work. And we have a very high interest in continuing to support work in Pennsylvania. So the more applications that come in, the higher chance that we have more Pennsylvania proposals that we're able to fund. So, you know, if you're considering it, please reach out and we'd love to talk with you. Kathleen, over to you.
Okay, so I want to talk with you a little bit about the DEP Environmental Education Grants Program. The program, it's an annual program, and as we've been talking about checking the RFPs, all of the annual guidance is available in the Environmental Education Grants Program Manual, which is available on the EE Grants website, and you'll have that address a little bit later. Typically, our grant round opens up in September with the deadline of December. And this is a 1-year project period. It begins on July 1, ending June 30th of the following year. And funding for this program is provided on a reimbursement basis. The good news is that we are currently accepting applications for the 2022 DEP EE Grants Program. I am more than happy. I would welcome any kinds of questions that you might have if you have an idea. So we're accepting applications through December 10th of this year. Our project period is July 1, 2022, and then projects need to be completed by June 30th of 2023. And the next slide. So as the name implies, we are providing funding for environmental education. And what that means is that we will not provide funding for anything that is not solely environmental education. We provide funding for non-formal programs that engage any audience, youth, teachers, farmers, any community members, as well as formal programs. And we look at within the pre-K through 12 range. We are looking at things that for the formal programs that are locally based, student-led, hands-on action projects, involve teacher professional development, provide career awareness related to the environment, and have a basis in the state academic standards. Next slide. We have a couple different levels of funding within the DEP EE Grants program. We have mini grants that provide up to $3,000, and these are usually for locally based projects, whether they're school, county, municipalities. Match and partners are encouraged for mini grants, and they are encouraged. And really what that comes down to, we were talking about partners and budgets earlier, and we encourage them, and I think that from a reviewer standpoint, if all things were equal in looking at too many grants, it seems as though a project that would have match and partners might end up scoring higher than when compared to a mini grant that does not have match and partners. For general grants, we have two levels. General grant level 1 is for up to $20,000, and we consider this large scale projects that have a regional or statewide reach. For general grants, level 1, 20% match and partners are required. And then we have an even larger general grant we refer to as general grant level 2, which can provide up to $85,000. And this is for non-formal projects that widely engage teachers and youth at the county, state, and national levels. What do we mean by widely engaged? Direct participation from students and youth from at least 60 Pennsylvania counties. And out of those that are engaged, 30% are from environmental justice areas. Again, there's a 20% match and partners are required. And for all of these projects, we talked about the MIWI framework. This MIWI framework can be applicable to all these funding levels. Can I have the next slide, please? We have 3 priorities in the DEPE grants program: climate change, water, and environmental justice. And when we're looking at climate change, we're looking for projects that promote practical solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change impacts. And again, if you look at the DEPE grants manual, there is a long list of examples of things that might fall under the climate change priority. Water, we're looking for education projects that promote effective ways to reduce non-point source and source water pollution. And these could be tours, demonstration projects, plannings, etc. And then environmental justice. And when we look at this, we're looking at projects that engage people living and or working within environmental justice areas and addressing priority topics like climate change, water, or another pertinent environmental issue to that environmental justice area. Next slide, please. We have a list of eligible applicants: public and private schools, incorporated private schools, intermediate units, incorporated conservation and educational organizations and institutions, colleges and universities, county conservation districts, incorporated nonprofits, and businesses that are registered in Pennsylvania. Again, we talked a little bit about partnerships early on, and just to remind you that there may be entities that are not on this list that have an interest in applying for a grant, such as a municipality. They are encouraged to partner with one of the eligible entities. Next slide. So more information on the EE grants program. Again, that application deadline is coming up December 10. The address is being shown. Perhaps somebody could write this in the chat. If the other way to find the DEP EE grants program is to go to www.dep.pa.gov, and there's a grants icon on the home page. Hit that and scroll down to environmental education, and then you can go directly to the environmental education grants homepage. Tammy had mentioned what are environmental justice areas, and the definition for DEP is the census tract or block where 20% or more of individuals live in poverty and or 30% or more are identified as minority. All but one Pennsylvania county contains an environmental justice area. One of the things we found in some previous years is that it absolutely was clear that environmental justice areas were going to be people living in or working in environmental justice areas were going to be engaged by these projects. It appears as though applicants were not aware that of the environmental justice areas. So there's the DEP area viewfinder. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm more than happy to talk with anybody if you have a question while you're going through the application process, or if you have some preliminary questions before you begin, or if there's something in the manual that's not clear, please feel free to give me a shout. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. In fact, I'd welcome it. And the next slide, I think we might be done with DEP. Okay, thank you.
So should be unmuted now. Am I? Yes, good. Okay. So you've heard the saying, try again. Grant writing is fun, tiresome, difficult, everything and all of the above, all in one big package. It's inspiring because you get to share all your ideas. And it's potentially, you know, it cuts hard sometimes when your ideas don't get the money. But that's okay. What we are asking you to do is consider that all of these grants are very competitive, and that maybe for this time round, it didn't fit. Or maybe for that particular grant, it didn't fit. But the neat thing about the groups, especially like with the NOAA group that we do so much work with, is they give you really good feedback. And they ask you really good questions. And you know why you weren't funded so that you can go back and make those corrections. Maybe you need to strengthen a partnership. So talk to your partners about how they could support things better or what ideas they have. Don't reapply with the exact same proposal the next time around. You're going to want to go back right after you get your input and make notes and make edits. And then between this time and the next time that grant opens, you're going to work on it, pick at it a little bit, and then hunker down at least those 6 weeks beforehand to make sure that you have the pieces put together. But one of the things Steve mentioned, like a wish list earlier, I have a running midnight notes list that when I wake up at the 3 a.m. thing and I have all these ideas going to my head, I either try to type them out on my phone or I do word to text. I have learned that it's not a good idea to physically write them at that time of night because you won't ever be able to read it again. But keep those notes coming, and then it'll come to you. They'll fit together with what that program officer suggests that maybe you might look at later. The other thing is sometimes once you start looking, you might find another grant that suits your needs a little bit better. And don't be afraid to rewrite what you wrote and tweak it for that other grant. That's okay. No one's going to judge you on that. It's not plagiarism because you're writing your own thing. Okay. But the other thing that you need to keep in mind is that some of the big organizations do change their funding priorities as time comes and goes. We've seen some of that with administration changes, both at the state level and at the federal level. And then other organizations, some of the big funders across Pennsylvania, like William Penn, depending on the needs of their organization and the needs of their community in which they fund, they will change their funding as well. And the best thing for you to do is be ready for when that door opens. Sometimes, like National Science Foundation or some of the larger organizations, USDA, sometimes they are so competitive. If you get invited to come back, I mean, if it's frequently, they will say, if you don't get funded next year, they'll give you hints as to what to adjust, not promising any funds, but they'll give you hints. And sometimes it can take 3, 4, sometimes even more times to actually land that grant, but it's worth it. If you think your goals are worth it, then it's worth the effort. So looking back at this last hour and 10, 15 minutes, what were some of the most important tips that you learned today? Just dump them in the chat. Do one of those chat waterfalls, but I'm not going to make you coordinate the push. So take a few minutes. Wait.
And
So you all knew all this ahead of time?
there we go. Now we're starting to get. Now, what new tip did you learn? And while they're doing that, Tammy, go ahead and give me the next slide. And I'll wrap us up.
Okay, there we go.
All right. Find your next environmental education, sustainability, or related grant. Here's a couple good places where our team of the 5 of us have found different grants, and there's many other places too. And there were some people adding those to the chat. That was our first prompt. So scroll back through the chat before you leave and write down some of those other places to find funding. NAAEE is an excellent place. You can create an EE Pro account for free, and you can sign up for lots of different newsletters. But the EE News, the main newsletter that they send out, email news, the bottom part of it has links to grants, upcoming grant proposals. So they have a pretty good collection nationwide, and they keep that updated. In our region here, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed region, all of the states and DC in this area, check out Bay Backpack. There's a funding page on Bay Backpack, and lots of other opportunities and partners and organizations that you can find there. And if you're looking for some of those big federal multi-year grants, sign up for notifications, and you can set those notifications at different intervals with different agencies. But look for things like grants.gov is probably one of the biggest ones. They'll have they'll have most of the federal grants in there, not all of them. Some agencies do their own thing. NSF, you can regularly check that one and get notifications from NSF. Same thing with NASA education, NSPIRES. You can bookmark NOAA web pages for funding opportunities that recur year after year. And then some other ones available in Pennsylvania that we just listed until we got to the bottom of the page. We know most of the audience are people from Pennsylvania, but we do have some out of state and other farther virtually traveled attendees. But some other ones, of course, you've heard about the DEP environmental education grants. Department of Education has an eGrants webpage, particularly if you're going to partner with a school. Right? NOAA Chesapeake BWET program, DCNR, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in Pennsylvania, has grants for, a lot of them are for parks or trails, but there's also training grants that are available there. Department of Agriculture are a really good place to look. Also, Fish and Boat Commission, if you're interested in getting more people exposed and interested in fishing and boating, they've got grants available. We've had some success here lately at the Stroud Center in education with the National Park Trust. There's National Park Service, the foundation, and the trust. So we've had some success there doing a lot of community education. Chesapeake Bay Trust also. So there's so many more. But do scroll back through the chat. And also I would say, just don't forget about your local businesses, your local charities. They, especially for smaller money or materials, they're almost always pretty willing. If you give them a one pager about your project, to pitch it, and they're almost always willing to chip in, for education related types of projects. All right, so next page. Here's our contact information and our emails. So for the 5 of us, even the net who, like I said, contributed before and had a lot of these ideas and has been a successful grant writer, also her ideas are incorporated in here. You can email any one of us for information. In a few weeks after we compress the video and all that fun stuff, we'll put it on our YouTube channel. and you can find the link right there. That link in the chat also, so you can go back to this, share it with your colleagues. There's the Stroud Center YouTube channel. So this will be up there probably within a couple of weeks. Our webmaster is usually pretty quick at doing those kinds of things. So we have a few minutes left, and we'll say after, for anybody who wants to stay after to ask questions, you may put your question in the chat if you're a little shy or don't want to be on the record. If you don't mind being on the recorded section, sometimes the questions are some of the best parts of webinars. We'll leave the recording on for a little bit longer. If you're not shy and don't mind, you can also share your video and unmute and just ask us a question if you want. Or yeah, raise your hand with the reaction button if you have a question, and we'll find you. So we'll do some wait time here and start fielding some questions. We typically have a lot of questions, which is great. But we hope that you learned at least one new tip or trick from some of us that are program officers that give away money, and others of us that are more experienced grant writers. We hope you at least got at least one new tip out of today's webinar. So let's go ahead and have some questions. If you were face-to-face, our wait time would be 5 to 7 seconds, but I've heard on Zoom the wait time would be about 20 seconds because you got to find all the buttons and everything. So we'll wait a little bit for questions. All right, and thank you all for joining us too. We'll stay on a little bit longer. I will stop the recording though. Stop recording. There we go. We want to stop the recording.